Hey folks, happy that you're here for the Mac and Mike show today. I'm Mac, he's Mike. We thought we'd do something fun today. When I say fun, it may be fun for us, maybe not so much for you. But obviously everyone knows who Nostradamus is. And what I suggested to Mike is we do a little bit of Nostra-Mac and Mike. And I hope you enjoyed as much as I enjoyed thinking about it. But there's been some really interesting major kind of moves recently in the news in the past few months. You can talk about Greenland, you can talk about Cuba, you can talk about um,
Venezuela.
Venezuela. Why do I always have trouble with Venezuela? It seems to be. We can talk. There's been some major things happening in Iran, and so it seems to me, and I know everybody doesn't agree with me, but it seems like to me that Donald Trump has this Midas touch. Everything he touches, turns it into a good news story, despite how his opponents like to paint it as being unsuccessful, un-American, undemocratic, all these other things they want to. I mean, he really is doing some good things that are not only good for us now, but potentially good long term for the United States of America and generations of Americans to follow. So, I don't know, Mike, do you have a favorite you'd like to start with? I mean, there's been some crazy stuff going on, but, even Artemis 2 is a good news story for America, isn't it?
Yeah. I'm not much of a prognosticator. I think that's the right word. I have a lot of friends, like, Brent. He's always wanting to see into the future. And the human condition is to be predictive by nature. But one of the things that always drives me nuts is we make these. I just posted the other day on Facebook, I said, if you make 1,000 predictions, sooner or later you're going to be right. Gene Dixon with President Kennedy. Ooh, she predicted his assassination. No, she made 1,000 predictions before that never came true. And of course, same with Nostradamus, it's a matter of interpretation.
Sure, yeah.
But, we are naturally, we look at situations and we're always anticipating what's coming next. So, I mean, of course, the Iran war is top on my mind. I think, it's going to depend, the future there is going to depend on if we make this kind of deal with them, they're going to stay in charge. It's going to lead us down one path. You just can't trust them. They've never held to an agreement, so what makes us think this agreement would be held to? The other way is we finally totally annihilate them because they refuse to talk. Hopefully, please refuse to talk. And we just smash the country and we get a new leadership in there. The problem is it's going to turn out a little bit like Iraq. There's my prediction, if it goes that direction, that there will be these internal factions fighting. There'll be sort of a semi-civil war inside of Iran. So that's the way I see Iran falling out. It's not a good situation either way, but we will stop the nuclear proliferation.
It's not a good situation in Iran right now, Mike, but, from a Nostra-Mac and Mike, I think 10 years from now, the country of Iran will be a much different nation, much more like the nation of Iran in 1978. Much more westernized, much more freedom, women not being stoned to death or hung because they showed a little bit too much skin, more freedoms for people in the streets. I think that right now their currency is virtually worthless. I think that, in a way, and we'll touch on Venezuela next, but in a way, not having the theocratic revolutionaries who are running the country prior to this war beginning, and them spending all of their money on their terrorist proxies, creating, as they termed it, not me, not the Allies, but they termed it a ring of fire around Israel. I think that Israel will be safer, and I think all of the the Middle Eastern countries will be safer. Iran not only threatened Israel, but also threatened the UAE and Egypt and Saudi Arabia, and I mean name the country in Syria, name the country in the Middle East, and Iran at one point or another threatened them. So I think that either these current leaders, whoever they are, because they took out a couple of the top rows of leadership, whoever the leaders that are in Iran now negotiating, whether they negotiate honestly or dishonestly, I think that the follow-up action by the United States is going to be to assist the general population of Iran, not in a military force kind of way, not boots on the ground kind of way like we did in Iraq, but rather give them help and support on the civilian side to help them create their own new government. And I think that they will do that. And I think the future looks much brighter for the nation of Iran, and in fact the entire Middle East, than it did before Operation Epic Fury began, and that Donald Trump took out Donald Trump by means of the United States military, which I have to tell you, so proud being part of the military, retired. They took out not only the current inventory of drones and aircraft and ships, the whole Navy and Air Force, but also the factories that produce them. So we not only stopped them with Midnight Hammer, stopped them from creating nuclear fissile material, but we also stopped them from being able to build conventional weapons. I think the outcome of what's going on in Iran is going to be eventually a much more peaceful Middle East. Now, one thing I think has to be done, and whether we do that in cooperation with the Iranians or if we do it by force, that fissionable material that has been buried underground with the bunker busting bombs, that material has to be recovered, because we can't have Iran digging that up and creating nuclear warheads. By their own admission, when they sat down at the table, they said we had enough nuclear fissile material to create 11 warheads. That's 11 places on this earth that would be much worse off if the Iranians were allowed to continue. So we'll see, but I think 10 years from now you're going to see a much more westernized Iran. And you can go back and look at the 1978-79 pictures and videos of what the state of Iran was, the nation of Iran was in those days. Again, bikinis on the beach, Western wear, not the kind of theocratic demanded garb that they demand of the women today. I think it's going to be a more free society, and I think Donald Trump and whoever in our military and in our government concurred and agreed, I think that the nation of Iran will have a lot to thank the United States of America for going forward.
Yeah, your prediction is long term. Mine was shorter term.
Okay.
So I see a lot of trouble in the short term.
I agree. I don't think that the transition from where we are today, with them trying to block ships transversing the Straits of Hormuz, with them taking shots at various ships of other nations, including the U.S. Navy, I don't think that's helpful, and I think that's going to lead to some disagreeable circumstances. I think that when the United States of America demands the fishable material be recovered, I think that's going to be ugly unless Iran has been brought to its knees and agrees to help us get that material out of the nation of Iran. Well, you mentioned Venezuela. Venezuela, once the elimination of Maduro as the president, that seems to be going much smoother. I mean, we have cooperation in many ways. We have conversation. We have state to state, that is nation to nation, discourse occurring with the current leadership of Venezuela. And instead of that oil going on a cut rate price to China and the money going into Maduro's pockets, it's now the oil that's being shipped out of Venezuela is being shipped out at market prices, and the people of Venezuela are sharing in that wealth. That's a good thing, isn't it, Mike?
Yeah, I think to prognosticate there and to look at the future of Venezuela, I think they may return to being the most prosperous nation in South America as they once were. The strategy there is kind of interesting to me. Nobody ever really thought of leaving the people in power, essentially, but holding this sword of Damocles over top of them. Look, we got Maduro. Play ball, be nice, or we're coming to get you.
Yeah.
It's just that simple. And, in all honesty, see, they're reasonable people, comparing them to the crazies in Iran. Most Iranians aren't, but the people in charge are.
That's the difference between a theocracy and a socialist government.
Yeah,
they truly believe, the theocracy truly believes their message, and socialists Well, they don't necessarily agree with capitalism. They're much more conversational. They're not interested in suicide.
Yeah, it boils down to self-preservation. The one side doesn't care if it dies. Of course, Venezuelans do. They're more like us than the Iranian leadership is. So I see it becoming, and here's one of the other things. Talk about prognosticating into the future. All these countries that we're helping around the world, even in the Middle East, even Venezuela, you know what that really means? In some sense, somebody brought this up, it's more competition for us. And competition's a healthy thing. So this might unfold to be sort of interesting. What's the golf thing that the Saudis got involved with? There's the PGA here and the Love, is it? Or
LIV.
Live. That's taking a nosedive. But, it was a competition. And it's really strange to see that it came out of that region of the world. So we might see more of these unusual give and takes and competitions come up.
But I also see some latency in the cooperation with the United States. Venezuela was a problem for several of their neighbors with the way they behaved. Now they're being much more, let's say, good neighbor than they were before Maduro was removed. I think those nations who had unpleasant circumstances with Maduro and his government might be more friendly towards the United States now that Maduro's been removed and their bad actor in their neighborhood has been removed. I think that's true in the Middle East as well. When Iran wanted nuclear weapons, that meant that the UAE and Syria and Saudi Arabia, et cetera, down the line, all those other Gulf states, they wanted to have nuclear weapons as well because they couldn't let their unpleasant neighbor be the only one with a nuclear weapon and be able to threaten them with it. So I think that those nations in the Middle East are naturally going to provide or be a little bit more cooperative with the United States of America in forward-going issues based on the threat that we basically removed from their neighborhood. So I think that's a latency kind of cooperation that we can expect. But you want to make a prediction about NATO, Mike? I mean, when we were ready to do Operation Urgent Fury, how many of our NATO partners stood up, stepped up, and decided to help us?
That's a tough one to see into the future about because it's all going to be contingent on whether we have a Trump-like presidency continue or if we get the, excuse my French, worthless Democrats back in charge. Trump believes in holding people to account. I mean, Republicans, conservatives, fair-minded people believe in that kind of thing.
Sure.
We're responsible for our actions or inactions. And of course, the biggest problem with NATO in the past has been its inaction. It just came out in the news, for example, I don't remember the numbers exactly, but, the United Kingdom used to have a great navy.
Yep.
Do you know that they tried to send one ship, which was the only one that they had that was operational, to the Middle East and something happened to the plumbing and they had to turn around and get it fixed? They cannot put enough ocean-going vessels to sea. They don't have any working carriers. None. And forget about destroyers. I think they have 11 or something and only 2 are operational. The best thing that they have is a few nuclear submarines. Even their standard submarines are in dry dock. But who else besides Great Britain has a decent navy? The French don't really have a great one. The Spanish, who are socialists and not our friends, they don't have one. And the other parts of NATO are the landlocked Poland and all those other countries. They don't have a navy. And it seems like some of the former Soviet bloc nations are some of our best allies.
Yeah.
Because they're closest to the firing line.
Well, they're also closest to the recent socialism that was removed, or whatever you want to call the Soviet rule that was removed, or they no longer live under. So they have fresh memories of what it's like to not be free. But I think also, Mike, when it comes to NATO, and you predicted this before in one of our earlier podcasts, and I think you're right, I think the United States of America is going to take NATO as a country-by-country kind of relationship. I think that some countries will get more cooperation than others, and rightfully so. You know, the Spanish wouldn't even let us fly in their airspace.
Yeah.
I mean, that's worse than that is being an enemy, not being an ally. Did you hear about the German politician who asked for the removal of all the American troops in Germany?
No, but I'd be happy to say, okay.
Yes, me too. I was in Germany. I was in Cape Town and Parmesans and a couple of different places, and I loved it there.
Yeah, I love it.
At least Germany when I was there before. I understand it's changed since reunification of East and West, but
Yeah,
the Germans and the German people and Germany, the bases that I was at in Germany, were all wonderful experiences for me. But you're right. I wouldn't be opposed to taking all of our troops out there, and like Ukraine. Let the Europeans stand up to the Russians if they're concerned about Russia and they don't want our troops there. Great. Let them stand up to Russia on their own 2 feet.
Yeah, we should be that's how I always viewed the United States when it came to that. We should be their backup. We shouldn't be the first in line. They're closer to the situation. It's their lives that are at risk. We didn't get involved in a Second World War until much later in the war. And maybe that's the way it should be. It's not that we want to wait for war to break out, but we shouldn't be the ones trying to make peace in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia. Let Europe handle that. If they need our help, we should assist.
Now, when it comes to NATO, Donald Trump himself said that part of the NATO response was based on the kerfuffle that occurred when Donald Trump said we ought to have Greenland as part of America. Now they've worked that out, and the agreement that they have is not that Greenland becomes part of America or becomes a territory of the United States of America, but rather we have a more expansive ability to put military bases that we need to protect our safety and really the safety of all of North America, not just
and Europe.
Not just us. So, but Trump's position was that because of we need to take Greenland and take it by military force if necessary. I never heard Donald Trump say that. I heard him joking about whatever means necessary, that kind of thing. But we have an agreement in place. But that gives us, I think, what the United States feels they need to defend ourselves and the balance of our allies from attacks over the Arctic. But Trump indicated that from a NATO perspective, there was still some angst or some hard feelings, bad blood because of that whole kerfuffle.
Yeah, it's that. It's even his first tenure as president, he was hard on NATO because they weren't living up to the agreed upon expectations of percent of GDP into their own militaries. And of course, some of them started to come on board, but there's still some resistance. By the way, back to Germany quick. I saw in the news recently that they are pushing to build up their military again. They want to be the dominant military power in Europe. Now, see, that is shades of scariness again. That's why we've always been hesitant to let the Japanese or the Germans, get too aggressive there. But as left-wing as they are today, I don't know that they would really cause that much trouble.
Well, Japan, as you mentioned, the Japanese, after World War II, Japan was precluded from having a military. And basically we said, no military for you. And over time, that has loosened, and Japan has been building, a military, which we've encouraged in some ways as being a counterbalance to China in the region, because China is a very belligerent neighbor to many of its neighbors. And Japan needs to be strong enough to defend itself against the potential China, bad actors.
So tell me what you think about what's going to happen in Cuba.
Cuba's an interesting thing, and the long term, I think Cuba is eventually to be a state of the United States of America. I think that we're going to go through a couple of different changes. I think that Cuba needs to come to some understanding with the United States of America that they are not able to be self-sufficient, not currently in its current makeup. I think that their economy is shot. Their currency is virtually worthless. People are, professionals are being paid what amounts to $20 or $30 a month in salary for jobs that would be six-figure salaries in America. So I think economically, they're going to change because they can't even keep the lights on. You know, they can't keep the lights on. They can't keep businesses operating. Most of the automobiles they have in Cuba are either cars from the 1950s that were left over from pre-Castro days, or they're Eastern European or Russian, basically boxes of crap. You know, I mean, I'm sorry, the Eastern Bloc and Russia as the USSR had really didn't have a lot of success in building high quality automobiles for use, and that's basically what they have. There's some 1950s automobiles in Cuba that are now being operated with marine engines. You know, they take engines out of boats and put them in cars because they can't get parts for the old automobiles.
Can't they get Chinese cars?
Well, I think they can, but the Chinese cars are the same, but they're in many ways junk too. Although the Chinese electric cars, especially their high-end ones, can be very, very nice cars. They can be, but again, they don't have any electricity in Cuba. So what good does an electric car do you?
Yeah, well, I understand their whole automotive industry is on par with ours now.
Yeah.
It didn't used to be that way.
Yeah. Well, what happens is the way China did business with the United States is they demanded that their country have a stake in every business that opened in China. And what that meant is the Chinese military, because there were no private investors that could do that kind of thing. So when all of our car manufacturers went to China to sell cars, build cars and sell cars, what China did is demand that the Chinese military become equal partners in any business enterprise there, and then they proceeded to steal all of our intellectual property. So they learned how to build cars and build airplanes and build all these other things. I've said to you a long time, Mike, one of the problems with communist Chinese, the country of China under the communists, is that they don't allow intellectual freedom. They don't allow people to think outside the box. They don't allow creativity. You will think the way they tell you to think. And that stifles any kind of progress that they might make in business and industry. So what do? They steal the intellectual property of other countries who do have the ability to do free thinking and free thought. And once they can steal it from us or from other industrialized nations, then it's okay for them to use it. But they don't allow their scientists and their engineers to the freedom to think outside the box to create a lot of the new technologies that other nations have.
I think that's changing. I think they try to squash any kind of political differences or thinking outside the box, but they become quasi-free enterprise or capitalistic in some areas. It's just like my friend Stan's country, Yugoslavia. Remember the Yugo car?
Yeah.
Talking about the piece of junk?
Mm-hmm.
But what they did there is and they, up until the time it dissolved, you could grow your company so big, and when it got so big, the government would take over, but the person who started the company or the people who ran it were given cushy positions so that they didn't feel like, because that would disincentivize anybody from starting a new company that would grow, because it's, what's the point? It creates apathy. And I think the Chinese have kind of figured that out by now, because they have billionaires in China, right? Now you get out of line as a billionaire, and you start talking stuff about the government,
and you disappear.
Yeah, you're going to find yourself in a Nike shoe factory along with the Uyghurs and
the problem,
10-year-old kids.
The problem with China, Mike, and there's several, but one of the many problems is that they had the one-child policy for so long. They don't have women of a certain age who are marrying Chinese men of a certain age. That creates a problem. The other problem associated with that is that the one-child policy has this huge gap between the elderly people, the older generation, who used to run all the business and industry, and the younger generation. There's not enough of them to replace them on a one-for-one basis. So what they're doing is they're importing a lot of technology workers from other countries because that gap, their ability to run oil fields, and they don't have a lot of oil fields, that's a bad example, but in order for them to run their manufacturing concerns. The other problem is that based on the Chinese government rosy projections, they started these building projects of literally billions of dollars worth of, high-rise apartment buildings and homes and places for people to live, and they don't have the people to live there. So what they're doing in a lot of cases is they're just destroying them. They're just tearing them down. demolishing, because they don't want all these empty places to be a focal point of. So they've got a lot of internal issues that have been generated basically, mostly from the one-child policy of the last however many decades it was. So they have their own set of problems, and they're not easy problems to overcome.
Yeah, so prognosticating into the future about China and all these other places, what about the United States, Mac? Where do you see us going?
Mike, I think that, and you said this to me before, and it crystallized this thinking for me. You said to me one time, how do you think the allies of the United States feel when we go through our every 4 or 8 year, almost, crazy periods of, we go from a Biden to a Trump, or from an Obama to you get what I'm saying. The policies of the United States of America, based on the Democratic and Republican Party, it's almost like whiplash. Mm-hmm. And it's not just whiplash for our allies, for our partners, for people who want to do business and want America to be the leader that it is, but also for the people of the country. We're a pretty divided country, Mike, and until or unless we decide which direction we want to go. I said to you recently, Donald Trump was doing some things in Iran, and there was a time period where all the news media and a lot of people posting on social media started talking about Taco Tuesday, two-step Donald Trump, where he's not going to do this and he's not going to do that and he's afraid to do this and he can't. And to me, that smacked of giving aid and comfort to the enemy. When our opponents in Iran saw how divided America was in all of our media and them basically speaking out against the policies of Donald Trump, in my opinion, it emboldened them to be much more hardliners, not to create a peaceful solution, but rather to hold out and hope that, the midterm elections may not go in Donald Trump's favor. Maybe the politics of America will change. Donald Trump has to run for re-election in a couple of years. Maybe we get another Joe Biden. And I think the game that Iran is playing is, if we just wait long enough, we hold out long enough, we'll get another President Obama or another President Biden, and we'll be able to do whatever we want to. And I'm not sure that that's such a good bet to make, and I don't think it's such a good idea. And I certainly don't think it was proper or appropriate for our media, much of our media, and much of our individual citizens through social media, come out with this repartee that seemed to indicate that Donald Trump was not as strong as our opponents may think. We had many different versions of that in World War II, and most of those people who disagreed with the government or did things that could hurt the war effort, they were treated pretty harshly indeed. And I'm not so certain that America can. I'll give you an example, Mike. You said, what do I think of the future of America? We just heard this story. A grand jury just indicted the Southern Poverty Law Center, and what they indicted the SPLC for was taking both donor money and government money and giving it to support hate groups that they could then work against trying to shut down. In other words, they created an enemy for themselves. They're anti-hate, they don't want any kind of insidious behavior. Basically, they were a left-wing group, so they looked at right-wing groups, including people like Moms for Liberty and, Tucker Carlson and Charlie Kirk. They looked at them as being enemies of the state. And what they did is they got this money both from donors and from grants from the government, and they turned the Charlottesville media frenzy, that was a made-up thing where they seeded the money to get the people, the right-wing activists, if they were right-wing, to protest and then created the deaths that occurred so that they could come around and as Joe Biden said, Donald Trump thinks there's fine people on both sides. Well, listen, the people on both sides were the same ones. They were being paid by the Southern Poverty Law Center. So I think that kind of vitriol.
No, Trump clarified that he wasn't talking about the white supremacists. That's where they always cut the video.
I know.
Just want to get that clear in there.
No, I knew that, Mike. And those people who want to find the truth are able to find it. Those people who want to be fed lies because that's their confirmation bias, they're not going to look for the truth. But when you say, what's the future for America? I'll tell you, I see a fork in the road up ahead of us, Mike. At some point in time, America is going to have to decide who and what they are. Are they the people that participated in World War I and World War II? Are they the people that stopped the Nazis in World War II and stopped the the Japanese from things like the Bataan Death March and from the rape of Nanking? I mean, are we the country that's going to stop those kinds of atrocities? The killing of massive numbers of people in the Nazi in concentration camps. And it wasn't just Jews. I mean, it was Catholics and it was Poles and it was, a lot of different people who the Nazis decided, the disabled. I mean, there was a whole lot of people that the Nazis genocide. And America was the primary way in which it was stopped. I don't mean to demean the participation of the other allied nations, but guess where all the war material and all the fighters and the bombers and the tanks and the guns and the ammo, where did all that come from? It came from the United States of America. And without the United States of America, Europe would be speaking German today. That's just, you can parse it any way you want to. We won that war. Was that a good thing? I can point people who say that wasn't a good thing, that if the Germans had overtaken Europe, we wouldn't have some of these DEI woke kind of left-leaning, anti-common sense people running most of the European nations.
It's a double-edged sword.
It is. And would you go back in history and change it if you could? So, but again, as far as the United States of America, I see a fork in the road. And I don't think America has to become MAGA. I think that more of the common sense concepts and idea of make America great again need to be implemented by a wider group of people. I don't understand why people on the left will disagree with everything Donald Trump says. And you have some friends that are like that, I mean, it doesn't matter if Donald Trump says, hey, the sky is a pretty blue color this morning. No, it isn't. It's ugly gray. It doesn't matter what the color of the sky is. They're just disagreeing with Donald Trump. I don't think that we're going to have a follow-on leadership like Donald Trump in America's White House. What I do believe, however, is that you're going to see America has a choice in a couple of years. Are they going to put more of a Joe Biden kind of leadership in place, or are they going to put more of a J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio et al. Kind of leadership in place? I think that this next presidential election is going to be a very, very critical fulcrum point in America's history and its future. Are we going to continue to go the road that Joe Biden was taking us on? Remember going back to remember when Jimmy Carter showed up on television with a sweater on and said, Americans just can't be used to being America anymore. We're going to have to get used to dealing with less. And Obama said the same thing. And I'm going to tell you something. America, the land of the free, the home of the brave, the land of ingenuity, necessity is the mother of invention. How many good ideas have come from America? How many natural resources does America have? 20 years ago, we were a net importer of oil. Today, we're a net exporter of oil. Why is that? That's because people, like the people associated with Make America Great Again, came up with new ideas and new technologies, a new way of getting those resources out of the ground. Many countries don't have the ability to be able to even think about those ideas, let alone bring them to fruition. So when you say, what is the future of America? Future of America is bright, very bright. We will continue to be the world's leader. I hope we will not only continue to be the world's leader in technology and business and manufacturing and finance, but I hope we will be even more of the leader in moral matters. When Christians in Nigeria are massacred, when churches are set ablaze with people inside and no one says a word, that's a bad thing. And I think that America is going to have to come to grips with there are certain ideologies that don't want America to exist. And I think America is going to have to come to grips with that. The Marine Corps, the Marine Corps hymn says, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. Well, the shores of Tripoli were where the Barbary pirates were, where followers of the religion of Islam thought that if you were not a member of the religion of Islam, you should be enslaved. That's not hyperbole. That's just fact. That's history. You can't change those facts. So the followers of that particular religious identity don't believe that America should exist with its religious freedom. Is America willing to accept that or not? And I don't know. Look, I'm old, and my kids and grandkids are going to be around to see what happens. But I think that America is going to come to grips with this whole idea of we truly do believe in freedom of religion. And regardless of what some people believe in their ideology, America will be that shining city on that hill, that beacon of freedom, not only religious freedom, but freedom of speech and freedom of action and all those other freedoms. But I'll tell you, it's going to take a couple more rounds of leadership, not to the same level of confidence and extreme that Donald Trump has led us in, but a solidly conservative, common sense future for the United States of America. And I think we all need to pay attention to who we elect as our leadership, because that's going to be an important ingredient to our future success. Agree?
Yeah. I think we beat it up.
All right, then I guess it's time to say Mac and Mike.
Out.